Okay, taking up immediately where I left off a minute ago, President Wilson continues his efforts to get the Europeans to call off their war. And on January 22nd, 1917, as part of his annual State of the Union message, you've heard of that, President Wilson went public with his proposals. Now, the forays by Edward House, those had been, it was in the newspapers that House was there. The substance of it, as far as I know, had not been made public. This time it's out there. Wilson made his famous peace without victory proposal. And this was as part of his annual State of the Union message. And this is where he publicly called on the warring powers to return to their pre-war boundaries and just discontinue the war. This time it's called peace without victory, because the problem is victory means somebody wins, and if somebody wins, somebody else loses, and whoever loses is going to be starting another war in another couple of decades, which is going to happen. All right, but anyway, we don't see that yet. This time, the Germans didn't respond at all, except that they noted that they had called upon the Allies for a statement of their war aims sometime prior to that and had not received a reply from them, so they didn't reply to Wilson at that point. But the Allied leaders, the French and the British, let President Wilson know through what we call back channels that if he could get the Germans on board, they were willing to talk about it. What does that tell you? You don't settle for a tie if you think you got a chance to win. You settle for a tie when it's looking like you're going to lose. And that's what the deal was in January 1917. Now, anybody could see what's going to happen, and it did. It's not going to be a two-front war anymore, because the Russians are at the point of exhaustion. The Russians are going to arrange a separate peace and get out of the war, leaving the British and French to face the full might of the German military. Because Germany's been fighting the French and British with one hand and the Russians with the other. With some help from Austria-Hungary, they're not pulling a whole lot of weight. So, Russia is about to bow out. So what would happen within weeks after that would be that the liberal revolutionary government of Russia is going to be overthrown. Communists calling themselves Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, will take over, and they'll sign a peace treaty. They'll sign a peace treaty and just take what terms they can get. They were very, shall we say, generous to Germany. That's going to permit the Germans to transfer vast numbers of troops and large amounts of equipment from the Eastern Front, which is now over, to the Western Front. And somewhere down the way, they will be in position to launch a massive offensive which will tell the tale. It'll either win the war or it won't, but it'll tell the tale either way, and the war will be over. The Allies can see that coming. So, Germany's answer came a few days later on January 31st, when the German government announced that it was taking up a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, to put that into context, at the outset, the German submarines had only been sinking Allied merchant shipping and warships if they could catch one. And sometimes this involved the deaths of American citizens, notably the Titanic, the Lusitania, where 128 Americans died. Wilson's response to that was to send protest notes. And Wilson insisted on a policy of, he had a word for it, not that big a deal, but he thought that citizens of neutral countries were protected and should be completely safe and not harmed by either side. He pushed that to its full extent. He didn't say this, but it looked like it. If citizens of a neutral country want to go just have a Sunday afternoon picnic out in the middle of the no man's land. Nobody's supposed to hurt them. So, anyway, um, so Germany had actually pulled back their submarine warfare after the sinking of a British ferry in the English Channel in 1916, where 2 Americans died. So, for about a year, the Germans had announced that they would no longer sink unresisting merchant vessels. So, if a merchant vessel stops, submits to a search, well and good. If they resist or don't stop when they're signaled to, that'd be different. 1917, they're going full throttle. Unrestricted means they declare a war zone around the British Isles and western France, and they're going to sink anything. This uh, Allied, neutral, American, merchant ship, yacht, rowboat, inner tube is going down if they catch it. Now, everybody knows that it's just a matter of time that before that will bring the United States into the war on the Allied side. Okay? Now, before that, the Germans, they're not afraid of us because we just barely have an army and we're not doing anything to get ready to participate in this war. And they know we cannot make a difference in the short run. But the way this war is going, nobody is pulling ahead. This thing could go on for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. It couldn't because exhaustion would have finished it off. So they don't want us coming in a long war, but they see a chance to get it over with. So unrestricted submarine warfare, that will bring us in. They know that, but they think they can win before we will have time to make a difference. So that was their response. Wilson then immediately broke off diplomatic relations with the Central Powers. One more little thing I need to throw in because it makes a difference. At the beginning of the war, the British Navy cut Germany's only transatlantic cable. And that cut the German government off from communication with Latin American governments. So Wilson generously allowed them to use our diplomatic cable just to make sure we're neutral. The British Navy tapped the cable. So they're reading our mail and tell us about that. I don't know when we found out about that. And intercepting German messages. And a message they intercepted is known as the Zimmermann telegram. Arthur Zimmermann was the German foreign minister, and he had cooked up this scheme to neutralize the United States in the event of us declaring war on them. The Zimmermann telegram was sent to the Mexican government, and it invited Mexico to invade the southwestern United States in the event the U.S. declared war on Germany. And you see how crackbrained this is. Germany promised that Mexico's reward would be Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Mexico was then supposed to act as an intermediary and contact the Japanese government and invite Japan to invade the American West Coast. Japan's reward would be California. Germany was prepared to overlook the minor technicality that Japan and Germany actually were at war. Japan did that just to give them an excuse to seize some German-held islands in the Pacific. There was a lot of schmoozing and fraternizing back and forth between the Germans and the Japanese, but nothing came of it. And Mexico was in the midst of a decade-long bloody revolution, and governments came and went with dizzying rapidity. Mexico couldn't have defended itself against Costa Rica practically, let alone invade the United States. But the Brits found a way to release that substance of that telegram to President Wilson without tipping off the Germans that their code had been compromised. The Germans went the whole war without changing their code. I guess they figured it had been devised by Germans, hadn't it? Lesser peoples could not unlock its secrets. And they might not have if they captured a couple of code books. This was released to the American public. There was outrage. This personalized the war. Until then, January, February 1917, the war had been distant. It was a European war. It had little directly to do with us. We would watch it with great interest and all that, but it didn't involve us. Now it does. The German government was plotting to bring the horrors of war onto American soil. That probably tipped the balance politically. Because when the time came, getting a declaration of war against Germany was not an automatic slam dunk, as we'll see. Okay. Late March, word arrived that 3 American merchant vessels had been torpedoed and sunk by German submarines. First time they've hit our vessels. That's what it took. President Wilson then went before Congress and made a speech asking for a declaration of war. It was phrased in very high-flown, moralistic terms. And he didn't actually use the words, war to make the world safe for democracy or anything like that. But the idea he was putting forward, and it won't be the last time you hear me say it, was that we don't like war, we don't believe in war, but if we just make the effort this one time, we would be in position to set up mechanisms that would ward off future wars. He got a thunderous standing ovation. But in his presidential car on the way back to the White House, he turned to an aide and he said, "My message today was a message of death for our young men. How odd it seems to applaud that." Congress didn't act immediately. It was like 4 days, something like that, before they came across with the declaration. And even then, 6 senators and 50 representatives voted against it. Footnote, one of the 50 who voted against it was, I believe, whether it was Montana or Wyoming, one of the western states only had 1 member of the House, and it was the first woman ever to serve in the U.S. Congress. And I'm going to put her name up here because I can't think of it right at the moment. She voted against the declaration. And it turned out she had just been elected. She was a freshman congresswoman. But the war proved to be more popular than she was, and she was not reelected. Time passed, the 1920s came and went, the 1930s came along, and the mood had changed dramatically. By the 1930s, American public opinion at large had repented of that war and thought, that is the stupidest mistake we ever made. We're not ever going to make that mistake again. And in 1940, realizing that this woman had been right and the voters had been wrong, she was elected to a second term in 1940. Now, on December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, Congress voted to declare war against the Empire of Japan. There was 1 no vote. Guess who? The same woman. 3 days later, when we declared war against Italy and Germany, she got some letters and telegrams from back home, and she voted for it that time. Okay, so the United States declared war. Now, why did we enter the war? Why did Wilson do this? It's a bunch of stuff, but I get it down to 3 things. For one thing, I don't know how much influence this had on Wilson. Maybe it might have had more influence on political forces. But what came to be believed 20 years later was the fact that we had let the Allies get deeply in debt to us. Okay, by about 1916, Britain and France didn't have any money left to buy stuff with or to pay for it with. And that, if we just say, well, sorry, no cash, no deal, we'd be condemning them to defeat. So we started selling to them on credit. Our banks were lending them the money to buy munitions and foodstuffs and stuff like that from us with. So by the time the war is over, we're into them for about $10 billion. That was an immense sum in those days, much more than now. And it was believed that we went to war to bail out the bankers and the munitions makers. That if we let them go down, they won't be able to pay us that money back. And our bankers and munitions makers who are not popular will take a hit. Okay, we'll take this up in part 7.